It's a pleasure to be here today at Brown University for another in the series of archival interviews around the history of Brown Medical School. I am Jeff Borkin, the Chair of Family Medicine and the head of the Archival Committee. It's my distinct pleasure to have Dean Donald Marsh, the former Dean of the Brown Medical School, who has most kindly come from Southern California back to cold Providence, Rhode Island to be interviewed today. Today is 10/29/2007. We are at 169 Angel Street in the CIS building. Dean Marsh, first of all, thank you for coming.
You're very welcome.
I was wondering if you could say, just start out by saying a little bit about yourself and how you ended up at Brown.
I was a graduate of the University of California, San Francisco Medical School. And as a medical student, I did research. And I instantly developed a real love and a passion, in fact, for research, scientific research. I did take an internship, but it's clear that my interest lay in research. And so I did postdoctoral training in physiology, which was my primary interest, and in the kidney. And I worked in the kidney my entire life. I worked, my first faculty appointment was at New York University School of Medicine in the Department of Physiology and Biophysics. And then I moved from there to the University of Southern California to become a professor of biomedical engineering. And the reason for that was that I was interested in applying more quantitative techniques, mathematical modeling and so forth, to physiological problems. After a few years there, I became chairman of the physiology department at USC's medical school. And that gave me some taste for organizational matters, administrative matters. And the USC Medical School, in fact, went through a very difficult period with a rather severe budget deficit. And a number of the chairmen were involved in trying to rectify that problem. I was one of those. And I came to have a much deeper understanding as a result of that experience of medical school finance. I was contacted initially about being a candidate for Dean of Biology at Brown. At that time, there was a different organization than the one I was ultimately handed. There was a vice president for medicine and biology, who's Pierre Galletti. There was the dean of medicine, who's David Greer. And Frank Rothman was the dean of biology. He then became the provost who recruited me. It was clear when that the recruitment for the dean of biology was put aside because of reorganization. The Corporation Committee on Biomedical Affairs recommended that all three of those positions be conflated into one, and that person should be the dean of medicine and biological sciences, and that's the position for which I ultimately interviewed. And I think that the reason I was attractive to Brown was because of my basic science background. I had an MD, but I was a basic scientist. And I think it's probably true that I would not have been attractive to almost any other medical school in the United States because I did not have substantive clinical experience. But it was clear at the time that when I got here, that the clinical departments had not been integrated in any meaningful way into the life of the medical school. And that was a high priority. But that meant, in effect, that the control of the search process was in the hands of the faculty on the campus, and they wanted one of their own. That really is what happens in a dean's search, and I was it. So that's how I got to Brown.
And could you tell us a bit about some of your first year?
Well, it was very interesting. During the recruitment, I learned how distant the clinical departments were from the life of the medical school, and even from access to the dean's office. And my understanding of the operation of a medical school had at its core the importance of the academic life in the clinical departments, and particularly in the Department of Medicine. At the time, there were 8 affiliated hospitals, each independent of the others. And 5 of those acute care hospitals had independent departments of medicine which nominally reported to the university's chairman of the Department of Medicine. But in practice, they were independent. They each had their own residency programs. And because of that, the applicants for our residency program saw 5 different Brown programs and found that impenetrable, an impenetrable mystery. The quality in the residency programs at that time was poor, by my estimation. So I set myself the goal of reorganizing the clinical departments and then bringing them more effectively into the life of the medical school. The other thing that I needed to do was to reorganize the basic sciences. Basic science at Brown has always been very strong, and it continues to be. In fact, it's grown a lot stronger. When I arrived, the basic sciences were organized into a single department with about 80 faculty. And there were subdisciplines within that department, but they had no departmental status, and that was atypical for American medical schools. So the corporation determined even before I arrived that that should be changed, and that was a task that was given to me. And so the current departmental structure is something that I helped to create in the first year that I was here. So those are the 2 main tasks that I saw. I had to recruit people into the dean's office. That went relatively smoothly, but those were the 2 main objectives that I set for myself.
Could you just add the years that we're talking about and some of the people who you recruited in?
I came here in 1992 in the fall. The academics, I'm sorry, the administrators whom I recruited included Fran McCrossan as Dean of Administration, Associate Dean of Administration and Finance. He had reported to Dean Greer before, but he was not at the center of the the medical school's administration. He proved to be especially effective. He understood, in a way, how the workings of the medical school, and I grew to trust him and to rely on him completely. And he never failed me. I mean, he was always a wonderful colleague to work with. We went through several iterations of development personnel. The medical school had never had its own development officer. And we wound up, as I say, after several iterations with a woman named Ann Payton, who was very, very effective. Both of those individuals have now left Brown. I recruited Steve Smith, who was already doing what he needed to be doing as Associate Dean of Medical Education, but I thought he had a plan for implementing curricular changes. I had some ideas about medical school curriculum. And my view of it was, and this is a rather cynical view, but I'll share it, is that medical school curricular reform is often imposed just on the basic sciences, and mainly by people in the clinical departments. And so I was somewhat skeptical, but he was a member of your department in family medicine, so he had the right clinical credentials, and he had what seemed to me to be a curricular reform in mind that was different from any of those that I had seen previously. And so I made the decision to bring him on as Associate Dean of Medical Education and to support his plan. And it took, it takes time to implement new curriculums, but it seemed to me to be the right thing to do. Those were the main appointments. There was, in addition, we needed an Associate Dean for research and graduate education, and I recruited Peter Schenk, who was in the Department of Molecular Microbiology and Immunology to that job, and we had a very successful relationship.
If you could say a bit more, you were dean for 10 years, I
Yes, that's
understand.
right.
That's a long time.
The distribution is bimodal among American medical school deans. Dean Greer, when he finished his term as dean here, took a sabbatical at the offices of the Association for Colleges of Medical Education. I'm getting that wrong, but at any rate, it's the Nationwide Association of Medical Schools. And he looked at the length of terms for medical school deans in the United States, and he found it was bimodal. Some people make it, some people fail to make it, and that's understood very quickly, and they don't last very long, and others serve for much longer periods of time. And I would say in that group, 10 years is, sort of about average.
So I would say, ask, how did you do it? What did you do? What were kind of the broad strokes of what you tried to do during the Marsh decade?
I understood that the highest priority is the basic sciences took care of themselves. I mean, the reorganization was easy. Everybody was in favor of it. That needed to be tweaked a little bit, but it basically worked. That structure is still in place today, and I think it was pretty successful. As I said, the basic sciences at Brown have always been strong, at least in periods that I know anything about. And those are people who could be basically given the opportunity to organize things to suit themselves. Everybody wanted specific disciplines, and so that was easy. The real problem was the clinical departments, and in particular the Department of Medicine. That for me was critical. The reputation of any medical school depends primarily on the reputation of the Department of Medicine. And the quality of the residency training programs, which impact undergraduate medical education, depends on the reputation of that department. So I saw that as the highest priority, really. And we did, the former chairman resigned, or retired from the position in the first year that I was here, and we started a search. That was Paul Calabrese, who was a very well-known oncologist. We started a search, and we narrowed it down to two very, very well-known people, one at the University of Chicago, the other at the Mayo Clinic. Neither one of them would come because of the structure, because we had 5 independent hospitals, no interconnection, actually there were 8. So, no, I think there were, I'm not sure the exact number of residencies. It was excessive. And it was a consequence of the fact that all these hospitals were operating independently and without any discipline or input from the dean's office. And so those two candidates would not come. And I understood that to achieve the kind of stature for the Department of Medicine that I thought Brown needed, some fundamental structural changes would have to be implemented. And President Gregorian, the president of the university at that time, impaneled a group that consisted of 2 members of the corporation committee, senior members, and the provost and the executive vice president for administration. And another individual who was very, very effective as a negotiator and had a very good business sense. I don't remember his title. His name was Brian Hawkins. He was an important contributor to that committee as well. And Fran McCrossin and I staffed it. And that committee recommended that we should reorganize our hospital affiliations. And basically, the committee decided that we should end our affiliation with the Roger Williams Medical Center. That, of course, was very painful for the faculty there, many of whom were very good, but this was just a structural reorganization that had to be given the highest priority. Shortly thereafter, conversations began between the presidents of the boards of Rhode Island Hospital and Miriam Hospital about a merger. And those conversations led to the formation of Lifespan. The importance of that to the medical school was that we could immediately combine the two residency programs. That we were able to do that just by enforcing our will, basically, if you will. I mean, we decided that it was going to happen, and it happened. There were Brown University programs, and if the programs wanted to maintain the university's name and the identification with the university, they were going to have to merge. One group was happier about that than the other, but in any event, it came about, and the result was an almost immediate improvement in the quality of the applicants to that medicine residency. And that enabled us to recruit an outstanding department chairman, who's Professor Ed Wing. And he's been very effective, and the department has prospered as a result of that. So I think we really achieved what I thought needed to be achieved with respect to that. I also formed a number of committees that were primarily for the meeting of the clinical chairs. Over time, there was a greater sense, I think, of the importance of the clinical departments in the life of the medical school, which, as I say, I thought was really critical for the health and growth of the medical school. And that was very successful. One other individual we recruited who was very early on. In fact, it was amusing because the president of Rhode Island Hospital at the time called me up the first week I arrived and said they were bringing in the leading candidate for the chair of the Department of Surgery. Was I interested in meeting him? The question was inconceivable to me. And I mean, I basically said, not only am I going to meet him, but I'm going to take over the search. And we didn't have a fight. I mean, they were happy that I was willing to be involved. And the candidate was Kirby Bland, who at the time was a very energetic and strongly academic surgeon at the University of Florida at Gainesville. And he came here, and he built a very strong academic department of surgery, a very strong research program, gained a lot of national prominence, and I was disappointed when he decided after 5 years to go back to his home, which is in Alabama, and to assume the chair in surgery at the University of Alabama. But he was really very effective. And there were other chairmen of the clinical departments who were equally effective, and they just needed to be given some sense of identification with the medical school. So that for me was, as I say, a very high priority.
How did you come to understand your job over the course of time? Can you divide it into sections, phases? Does it flow into one another? Were there different periods?
I started out by writing a paper for myself. I mean, academics write papers, I wrote another one. And this laid out, this discipline of that process forced me to come to grips with the details and the problems and the many accomplishments in the medical school, and to put it all in perspective and to formulate a plan. Nobody ever saw that, but that was a very important process for me. And then later on, in about the third year, I decided that the school needed a strategic plan. I never had one. And so I convened a committee of the faculty, and we started out to write a strategic plan. It was a really productive exercise because we enlisted the participation of the faculty in thinking about the future of the medical school. one of the things that was immediately obvious was that we didn't have enough research space on the campus. And the strategic plan, when it was finally published in 1996, included a proposal for a new research building. 10 years later, that building was built. It's now the new life sciences building. So that strategic plan, which was, as I say, was the first one that the medical school had ever had, was very important and transformed us. One of the reasons it was important is that many of the faculty at Brown really didn't have a conception about the importance of life sciences research in modern science. As we began to discuss the construction of that building with the faculty in the other departments, it gave us an opportunity really to make the importance of the life sciences, the idea that the 21st century is really going to be the century of biology. That idea was suggested to the other faculty at Brown, and I think it had quite an important unifying effect on the campus, particularly among the sciences.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about, you may have had some time to think about this, what were some of your major successes and major challenges?
Well, I keep coming back to the Department of Medicine because I think it was really a major challenge, and I think it was also a success. The reorganization took place in part because of initiatives that were taken by board chairman of the two hospitals. But that action enabled me to put the residencies together and to recruit a chairman who would command the respect of the rest of the academic community at other medical schools. And so that was a great challenge. It took several years to get that done. I was very fortunate in that Artemis Jakowski, who was a fellow of the corporation and at one point the chancellor of the university, provided the funds to endow that position. And as that proceeded, I began to understand the importance of endowing positions in clinical departments. When I started here, I think there were at most 1 or 2 endowed clinical chairs, and when I finished there were 12. So I see that as an ongoing need. The main increase in the number of endowed chairs was for the clinical departments, but I see that there has to be a comparable growth in the number of endowed chairs for the basic science departments as well. Given the current level of support for research in universities by the NIH, which is the main source of funding for biomedical research, universities are going to find it more and more difficult to really support the activities of the faculty which form the nucleus of the academic life in those departments. And there are a few places who have taken that challenge very seriously, and I think it's very effective in the success of their academic research programs. And the opportunities for graduate education, postdoctoral education, even for undergraduate education, are greatly enhanced by having the senior administration taking on that kind of activity. A month before I arrived, the Sunday Providence Journal had a picture on the cover of its magazine showing the president of Rhode Island Hospital standing with his back to the president of the Roger Williams Hospital with the caption, "Why can't these men get along?" And the issue was the cancer center. It was at Roger Williams, and there was a fight. Rhode Island wanted it. Roger Williams had it. There was no sense of cooperation at all. Rhode Island couldn't get any of its faculty to work in the cancer center. So it was a source of contention. A few months after I arrived, the Cancer Center Core Grant, this is a grant funded by the National Cancer Institute which supports the core activities of the Cancer Center, had to be renewed, and there was a site visit. And I talked to the president of Rhode Island Hospital, and I told him this conflict was basically intolerable and had to be resolved. And so at the site visit, I was able to get up and make a statement to the effect that we were now in a position to increase the interaction of the faculty interested in cancer research at many of the hospitals, where previously it had been really only at the Roger Williams. And the Providence Journal ran an editorial thanking me for that task. I mean, it was an obvious thing that needed to be done, but it in fact had not been done here previously. The greatest disappointment, I would say, of the 10 years was that we actually never got the Cancer Center put together. The medical school, of course, has no funds to put into an activity like the Cancer Center. It's entirely dependent on the support of the hospitals, who of course benefit because the Cancer Center is physically located at a hospital. There are faculty there who bring in research grants, and the research grants are able to support a lot of activity. They generate indirect costs, and they work very much to the benefit of the hospitals. But for a variety of reasons, that just never came together in the 10 years that I was here. Rhode Island has cancer incidence that's above the national norm, an age-adjusted incidence of cancer that's above national figures. So cancer really is a big problem here in Rhode Island, and I always felt it as a part of our obligation to deal, to help solve the health problems of the community, that we had to have a cancer center that was providing the latest in treatment for a variety of different cancers and providing research that would inform new treatments. And it was a great disappointment to me that we were never able to do that.
Other types of unfinished business?
That was the major one. It took me until about 1998, I would say, to convince the university administration of the need for the new life sciences building. That was a major achievement, and the rest of the time after that was spent in fundraising, which is very important, and in administering the operation. But one of the other problems that we had was that we were turning over presidents at a fairly high rate. Gregorian served a normal term, and he was beloved here. He was replaced. He left at a normal time. I mean, he had finished a campaign. He'd done all the things that presidents are supposed to do at universities. And, but then he left, and the university recruited Gordon Gee from Ohio State University, and it was just, I mean, it was not a good match. Gee lasted 2 years and then left to go to Vanderbilt. I understand now he's returned to Ohio State. And there was Sheila Bloomstein in the Department of Cognitive and Linguistic Sciences, who formerly had been the dean of the college, served for a year as interim while the recruitment went on for a permanent, and that search led, of course, to Ruth Simmons' appointment as president. But over those period of years, it was very, very difficult to undertake major new initiatives because the support of the university was needed and the support of the president. Everybody wanted to know what the president's position was, but there was no president, basically. And that stifled, I would say, that process. However well it may have worked out for the rest of the university, really stifled progress at the medical school.
You're speaking now about some of the stakeholders within, with whom you've had to interact for the sake of the initiatives at the medical school. Mm-hmm. Can you say more about relationships with the university and the university leadership in terms of the development of the medical school, your own initiatives?
I think that the administrators of the university, the presidents of the university always understood during the time I was here, always understood the importance of the medical school. The medical school was the most prominent part of the university in its relationships with the community. And it was only a positive for the university because it was providing care and free care and all sorts of expertise I like to tell the story that when the medical school started, or before the medical school started at Brown, the most people had to leave the state to get high quality health care. That was not strictly true. That is to say, it was not universally true. But many people from the state were going primarily to Boston for the high quality health care that was provided by the various medical schools up there, Harvard, Tufts, and Boston University, because there was a dearth of practitioners here in the state that could provide that level of care. And the result was that this provided an economic penalty to the state, because those individuals who went out of state were taking their health care dollars with them and spending them elsewhere. And as the medical school was built and grew, that trend reversed. And so increasingly, healthcare dollars are being spent in the state of Rhode Island, and that's because of the medical school, because of the recruitment of the excellent faculty and the residents who could provide the care. And so in all those respects, the medical school was nothing but a plus for the university. There's no question in my mind that the various presidents with whom I had to deal understood that. The medical school had a difficult birthing here because many of the faculty at the university, this was in the mid-70s, I think that's right, were concerned that the medical school would be a drag on the university budget. I would say that those fears have largely disappeared because it never was true. And in fact, during the 10 years that I was dean, the medical school budget grew at a higher fractional rate than the university budget, by far. And the university contributed, the medical school contributed in a very unique way to the growth of Brown as a premier undergraduate institution. We had this program of liberal medical education that accepted students for an 8-year program, 4 years as an undergraduate at Brown, and then 4 years of medical school. That was seen by many medical school applicants at the time as a wonderful opportunity, and so competition for places in that program was very, very intense. The result was that the acceptance rate in that program was lower than any other admissions program that was being run at Brown University at the time. So it helped in the development of the view that Brown University was a very exclusive institution. It was by itself, but the program in liberal medical education certainly enhanced that view, magnified it, if you will. You know, the provost who recruited me for and was served for 5 years was Frank Rothman, and he was a former dean of biology. He's a prominent microbiologist, and since I was also a basic scientist, I would say we had a supportive relationship. He was replaced by a cognitive scientist named Jim Pomerantz, who came to Brown from Rice. And Jim had his struggles with others, but not with me. We got along fine. And then Kathy Spear, who's also a cognitive scientist, replaced Pomerantz, and we had a very good relationship. She was replaced by, she was preceded by Jim Simmons, who was an anthropologist, came from Berkeley, where I actually was an undergraduate, and although I didn't know him then, but we had a fine relationship. So I would say the relationships that we had with the university were by and large quite successful. So I have no complaints. I mean, I know what goes on in some other universities, and what major problems can be created at other universities between the university administration and the medical school administration. Those, by and large, really didn't exist here. And there are always going to be differences over some matters, certain differences in priorities. It was never a serious problem here.
And another major group of stakeholders, the CEOs and the hospital boards.
Well, Brown was created in the image of the Harvard Medical School with respect to its hospital arrangements. Both of them own no hospitals, employ none of the clinical faculty, and leave the running of the hospitals to the medical school. I'm sorry, to the hospital administration. Harvard has a history of 150 or more years of operating that way, and the academic standards were very high at those hospitals. Brown has only recently begun to develop similar attitudes in its hospitals, and I don't think it's as far along. I think that the understanding of academic life in a clinical department is not as well understood at the Brown hospitals as it needs to be. Hospital CEOs were always facing financial problems, and I understood that. And I tried to work with them. But the reality is that high academic standards are retained in other medical schools, and it was always a struggle to try to achieve that level of academic excellence here.
What do you mean by academic excellence?
Well, for one thing, it is an insistence on research as a core activity of the faculty. And the necessity to provide support in one form or another to allow that activity to prosper so that it can become self-sufficient. I would say we made some progress. It wasn't as much as I had hoped for. The Cancer Center is one really good example of where we failed. But we made some progress, and it's a long process of education. The boards always want to have the prestige of the academic affiliation, but they don't have a well-informed view of what kind of commitment is required to maintain that at the level that is appropriate for a university like Brown. That was always a great frustration for me.
How were your dealings with individual CEOs? Do any come to mind?
This is not the place to discuss that. I'm just not going to get into that.
Okay. Any broad strokes you'd like to say more about CEOs?
Well, to their credit, they understood the need for having academic programs, and they remained committed to it in their own ways. I would say that the fundamental inability of hospitals to cooperate with each other was a major handicap here. No hospital, there were some specialty hospitals, the Butler and the Bradley, for example, and they were, those are both psychiatric hospitals, and I was surprised to learn when I got here how good the psychiatry department was. And it's really good. And that was only possible because of the support that those two hospitals provided. There was also support from some of the other hospitals, but the fundamental core support, the facilities were all were largely at those two hospitals, the Butler and the Bradley, and the quality of that psychiatry program, in my opinion, owes a lot to the support that was given. Now, it was uneven. One of the first things I had to do when I arrived was attend a farewell party for the faculty in what was probably the best triple board program, in particular in child psychiatry, who had a fight with the hospital CEO at the Bradley, and they were forced out. We were jettisoning one of the great programs in the United States. Now, to his credit, Marty Keller, who was the chairman, built that program back up. And so there was a review of the psychiatry department that was done while I was here. And the reviewer who, these are all external individuals, and the reviewer who looked at the triple board program said that it was the best in the country. This is completely new faculty. And those faculty were always people that I enjoyed interacting with. They were always strongly supportive of academic programs, and I was very pleased that we were able to come back to that level. You know, I think that some of those institutions deserve very great credit for what they achieve. Women and Infants is an outstanding facility. But again, it's a specialty hospital. They were always very supportive of academic programs, and I was grateful for that. I mean, they basically wouldn't turn us down. You know, we made reasonable requests to them, but they were always there. And they're a great benefit to the medical school. The others, you know, they were always struggling with financial problems, and I could understand that. But, you know, there's just a certain level of commitment that needs to be made, and it wasn't always there. There was always ambition to have the program there, but the support wasn't as forthcoming as it needed to be.
Did you have any interaction while you're here with the third-party payers, the insurance companies?
A very little bit. When I first got here, I met the president of Blue Cross Blue Shield of Rhode Island, and as I mentioned earlier, the President Gregorian had impaneled this group of senior university administrators and faculty and members of the corporation to review the status of the medical school and recommend structural changes. And the president of Blue Cross Blue Shield came and gave a very impressive demonstration, but they were not interested in supporting academic affairs. I mean, they, of course, the compensation for academic programs is quite complex. Residents, for example, are paid largely through Medicare support, and some faculty salaries are paid from that source as well. But, you know, the hospitals, in my opinion, did not make sufficient commitment of their own funds to the academic programs. Part of it was that they weren't as well endowed as they needed to be. So that had to be taken care of. And they're still working on it. I would say each of them probably did it as the best that he or she thought they could do for the medical school. But I would also have to say that, in my opinion, the vision was rather limited.
And another group of stakeholders, the medical community. Did you interact regularly? How were they involved with? Well,
I actually I interacted more with the community of physicians in associated with your department than with any other. Who was your predecessor?
Vince Hunt.
Vince Hunt. Vince Hunt was very active in the community of family physicians in the state. He built a program that was, in my opinion, outstanding. He had he had international connections. There was a very strong connection with a group of family physicians and basically the Ministry of Health in Jordan. And I had many visitors from Russia, from the Department of Health, who had come to work with him or to learn from him. And he always involved me in those things, and frequently that involved having a meeting with the Rhode Island, I guess it's the Academy of Family Practice, and every family physician in the state would come to those meetings, and I met them all, and we had a very good time together. I enjoyed that very much, and I appreciated his efforts to involve the medical school administration in it. I think I probably had greater contact with the community of physicians in family medicine than with any other department. Although psychiatry is always very interested in having me participate in their affairs. But I think it's not clear to me that there were very many community psychiatrists at those meetings. I had responsibilities with the foundations of the various clinical departments, medicine, surgery in particular, and but also with orthopedic surgery and neurology and neurosurgery and so forth. And so I would sit ex officio as a member of those boards, but that did not really involve the participation of community physicians very much, even though there were many clinical faculty who were members of those foundations, but of course whose practices were outside the walls of the hospital.
It's interesting that you had so much interaction with the Department of Family Medicine. I had heard that at some point this had been thought of as a primary care medical school.
That was true when I got here. David Greer is a primary care physician, and he was skeptical that Brown could ever become an important research institution. And the truth is, he didn't have a background in that kind of work. So given the administrative structure that existed at the time, where he reported to Pierre Galletti and had no responsibility for the basic science departments, he took an initiative which he thought was appropriate, and he built a very strong program in primary care here. It was very strong. They had good individuals here, and it was a movement whose time had come. The medical students became very heavily involved, I would say, in the program in primary care. They were very supportive of it, and they wanted more primary care instruction in the medical school. And I had come here from a medical school that did not have strong primary care, and so I didn't really have an opinion. But I understood the importance of the program as it had been established here. I gave it a lot of thought, and I came to conclude that it was really important to support primary care here at Brown. I had long conversations with Vince Hunt about the difference between family medicine and general internal medicine, and I actually got and Vince was a very cultured individual. And so those were very interesting conversations that he and I had, and I learned a great deal from him. And so I decided that we needed an associate dean for primary care, and we recruited Denny Hammond. Is that right?
Yeah. Denny Scott.
Denny Scott, sorry, for that position, and the program prospered. The problem that became quickly apparent is that the majority of the medical students at Brown were not electing to go into primary care areas. They were electing to go into the more conventional specialty areas of medicine. And it became pretty clear that a major problem for the medical students was the fact that the compensation for primary care physicians was inappropriately low, I would say. They were being charged basically with taking over the healthcare system in the United States. This was the era in which healthcare reform was discussed a lot. The Clinton administration was trying to formulate one for the nation, and primary care was the center of everything at the time. The medical students were voting with their feet, however. They were going elsewhere. And By that time, I would say also that by the time that became obvious, it became clear to me that the clinical departments had to be given a great deal of autonomy in the creation and maintenance of new programs of instruction. And there just wasn't any way around that. There was some support for primary care medicine here, certainly in your department and some in the Department of Medicine, but I would say the faculty were not, in the main, terribly interested in supporting primary care. And that's a large burden to overcome. There were primary care physicians here. The Medical Foundation had some, had an office of, with some primary care physicians and so forth, and they had a good residency program in primary internal medicine. But it just didn't, you know, it ceased to have the importance to the medical school that it had earlier. And I suppose you have to say that, or I have to acknowledge that, well, I was the dean, and I have to take some responsibility for that, because I was the leader of the institution, and that happened while I was the leader, and I suppose I could have invested myself much more heavily in maintaining the program in primary care. But the reality was that the students were, I mean, there were always some outspoken students, but the majority of the students were really not interested in it. And there was not all that much faculty support for it either. So I felt that giving it, making an effort to support at the level of prominence that it had previously would be not a good use of the time and effort and resources that I had. When I first got here, Brown was listed as #1 in the U.S. News and World Report among medical schools. And everybody was running around that Brown was #1, yelling that Brown was yelling is too strong a word, was very proud of the fact that Brown was #1. What really happened was that U.S. News and World Report segregated all medical schools into one of two groups: research intensive and not research intensive. And so it turns out that we were in the not research intensive group. And that meant we were, I think at the time, actually 62nd or 63rd in the nation among all the medical schools, but that's the way it segregated itself. I'd spent my life in research. I understood its importance. It was very important to me. And I also understood that the Brown Medical School was not where it would expect to be if it really understood what was going on in research, and in particular in the clinical departments. So I really devoted myself to building that up. That was a major effort for me, and it succeeded. I mean, a couple of years before I left, we were we went well over $100 million a year in total research income, external research income, for all departments in the medical school, and we hadn't been close when I got here. I'm just not close.
And how were your relationships with the research community, both within the school and around Brown, Rhode Island?
Well, I was very supportive, and I think they appreciated that. I made it a point to be supportive, and I think that that was appreciated.
Did you form any strategic alliances either within the state or outside of the state?
There were a number of informal relationships. Strategic alliances, in my opinion, have to be made by the individuals who are actually doing the work. Scientists always are looking for people to collaborate with. There's always some technique or another that they need that they don't have, or some point of view. And those are, that kind of informal interaction is essential to the conduct of modern science, and the best thing an administration can do is to facilitate those kinds of interactions and then to get out of the way. And so I did not see a point in having a formal structure. In fact, there was an effort made by Lifespan, once it formed, to merge the cancer centers of Brown and Tufts, because at that time Lifespan owned the New England Medical Center, which is the home base for Tufts. And that really was a mistake. It was Lifespan's idea, and it was a bad mistake, and it failed. And it led to some rancor, and it was completely unnecessary.
Do you want to say just a bit, because Pierre is someone who we won't unfortunately have the opportunity to interview. Tell us a bit about Pierre.
Pierre was a very gifted, talented individual. He was a real scholar. I first met him. I didn't really meet him, but we exchanged a lot of correspondence because at one point in my career, I was editor of the Annals of Biomedical Engineering, which was, and this was in the early years of biomedical engineering as a discipline. And whenever we had a paper submitted that had to do with perfusion techniques, like, for example, or for oxygenation of blood, that sort of thing, during an operative procedure, he would be the reviewer. And he was always very prompt and very disciplined and fair in his analysis of these papers. So I came from that experience to have a great appreciation for him as a scientist and as a human being. I really don't know the circumstances that led to his decision to retire when he did. I just don't know. But he stepped down, and he decided to remain active. He was, I mean, his accomplishments were very great. He had recruited a young man from Switzerland, Patrick Abischer, who is now the president of the European, of the, well, the word in German is the Eidgenössische Technische Hochschule, which is sort of an MIT equivalent at Lausanne. But he came here, and as a postdoctoral fellow, the two of them together started tissue engineering. It's a really important contribution. When Pierre stepped down, he went back to the department. And at the time, when that happened, there was this amalgam of 80 people in a department. And I promised him at the time that when it came time to have this reorganization, biomedical engineering's interests would be protected, that I would see to it that they had appointments available, the faculty appointments available, and they would have a graduate program. And we did that. And you know, that was part of the reorganization of the basic science departments, and that was relatively successful, I would say. As I stayed here, I came to know him, and he and his wife invited me and my wife down to Little Compton to have a meal with them from time to time. It was always a pleasure. He's a very intelligent, very thoughtful individual. I think the truth is that he was very frustrated by the organizational problems in the medical school, in particular the relationship between the medical school and the hospitals. And I don't think he ever really successfully solved that. And so over the course of the years, I think he withdrew more and more from interactions with the hospitals. And that was not good for the medical school. I think that's fair to say. But I think, for one thing, he had a robust research operation. And he was getting a lot more rewards from his research activities than he was from dealing with hospital presidents. I can't blame him for that.
Was it under your administration that were you the first dean of both the basic sciences?
Yeah.
And was that something that you negotiated prior to coming, that
no,
they
no,
negotiated
no.
for you?
The corporation committee at that time was headed by Charles Tillinghast, who was just a giant of a man in the Brown Corporation. He was a Brown undergraduate, and he had been president of TWA Airlines, and so he had, you know, really great national and international experience. And he came back to to Providence when he retired, and he was instrumental in the formation of the medical school. He was a very, very supportive member of the corporation. Oh, I'm sorry, what was your question initially?
Oh, in terms of the formation of your deanship, which was,
Oh, right.
I think the first one that was both
President,
clinical
no,
and the biological sciences.
when Galletti announced that he would retire, Gregorian asked Tillinghast to head a committee to evaluate the organization of the medical school. And they talked to a lot of people. I mean, they did a very professional job. And they came to the conclusion that that 3 jobs should be combined into one. And that vice president, since there was no responsibility for any hospital or for any clinical matters, there was no need to have a vice president for that position. So that person, or that job, then became Dean of Medicine and Biological Sciences, and that was what I was recruited into.
And then you had, in turn, a head of biological sciences, or
no, I was.
You were director?
We reorganized the biological sciences into, I think it was 6 different departments. And it was very strong here because those were the faculty who also had the responsibility for undergraduate biology education and for graduate education in the biological sciences. And I quickly came to see the real benefit of that arrangement. At the time, we had a relationship with the Dartmouth Medical School. They're in an area of very low population density. So they would take a class of 85 and then, or I think it was 85, and then 15 of them would come down to Brown to do their clinical years, and they would graduate with Brown degrees. And that gave me an opportunity really to look at the structure of how things were done at Dartmouth in some detail. And whereas we had 80 faculty to teach undergraduate biology, they had 8. And I just couldn't understand how they got away with that, because it couldn't be any good. I mean, here we have Ken Miller, who teaches introductory biology, and he's a giant of a teacher. And he's one of the most gifted individuals I think I've ever seen or heard in that kind of a capacity. For them to teach all of undergraduate biology with 8 people would require that all 8 of them have skills equal to his, and I just don't believe they had it. So I think that the teaching of biology to undergraduates at Dartmouth was very inferior to what we had, what we have here, and I'm surprised that that continued for as long as it did.
Well, a question in the area, every administration is both local but also exists within the context of its time, social movements, generation of new ideas. Were there any, let's say, social new movements or generation of new ideas that happened that you would say influenced what happened here or what you did?
Well, I mean, I can answer that with an anecdote. During the recruitment process, President Gregorian asked each of the candidates who was visiting the campus to give a talk to the assembled faculty. I can tell you that never happens anywhere else. That was his idea, and it was a very interesting exercise for me because it forced me to come to grips with some of the issues of what it might mean to be a dean of a medical school, and in particular a dean of the medical school where primary care was as important as it was then. And so I gave a talk basically on the cultural background of the development of primary care, going back to the 18th and 19th century. And that was really a fascinating exercise for me. And so I understood what was going on, you know, and what the cultural antecedents of that kind of development were. And that was the major social change that was going on. The other thing that happened, of course, during that period was that people began to understand the deficiencies of the healthcare system in the United States. And the Clinton administration attempted to formulate a plan, much too complex, but the medical school deans became involved in that. And for reasons that depended mainly on the notion that there had to be funds to support academic medicine and medical education. So a number of us had real input. When shortly after this whole effort got started, I received a call from Jack Reed, then a member of the Congress representing Rhode Island, and he just wanted to come and spend a couple of hours talking about health care and so forth. It was a wonderful meeting. He's a very intelligent, very attentive person, a very good listener, and I would say Rhode Island is blessed to have him now as U.S. Senator. He, at the time, was really not up to speed on health care, but he knew something was going on. 2 weeks later, the committee on which he served presented its bill, and there was included in it the substance of our conversation about the need for this health care plan to support medical education. And of course, the initiative failed, but that was really interesting to me, and it made it clear the importance of our having a good relationship with the congressional delegation. And I maintained a very good relationship with Jack Reed. He went on to run for the Senate, and he was elected, and he became more and more knowledgeable about health care. The medical school has a number of endowed lectureships that it gives, and annual lectureships, and one year we invited him to give that talk. It was really, really good. I mean, it reflected a nuanced understanding of the problems in healthcare and what Congress could and couldn't do about it, and I was greatly impressed. And so, a parent organization for the medical schools, the Association of American Medical Colleges, and they had some meeting going on in Washington, and we had a conversation, and we wound up, the AAMC wound up inviting him to be the primary speaker at this meeting. And I had the privilege of introducing him to the group, and he did a wonderful job. So, you know, I think I can't take credit for everything he's done in healthcare and his complete understanding, but I certainly feel that I had an influence at the formative stages of that process. And that was very good. And, you know, the other thing is that I did develop very good relationships with most of the members of Congress from Rhode Island, and most of the administration, with governors, and the medical and the university benefited from that. When we were building the life sciences building, we got well, both Jack Reed and for the Senate and Patrick Kennedy for the House were members of their respective appropriations committee, and we got earmarked funds for the construction of that building. That was a direct outcome of our relationship with those members. So I think that was very important, and in the state as well. There are individual, I mean, I think that the state is coming more and more, at least in the last years that I was dean, to understand the importance of the medical school to healthcare in the state. And so there was a lot of that going on. But I think basically the debate about healthcare and the failure of the Clinton plan were very important events in the life of all medical schools, and in this one also.
Those are very important. Any other kinds of stories that come to mind?
No, not really. I think I've probably said more than I should have already.
Just two final questions. One is, you mentioned also that I'm here because you had chosen me as a chair. What were you looking for in chairs, and which of the chairs did you bring here to Brown?
Well, it was very, I brought Ed Wing, I brought you, I brought Bill Chaffee. I mean, these were in the clinical departments. And in the time that I was here, Mel Epstein stepped down as chairman of neurosurgery, and we made the appointment in that department. I don't remember the young man's name, but at any rate. What I was looking for, I mean, the hospitals were paying the bills for most of these people. And they wanted people who would take care of the clinical responsibilities in those academic areas. And of course, that was important. I mean, they had to be responsible for for the clinical programs that they oversaw. I insisted, because no one else was doing this, that they also have an academic orientation, that they understood the value of research, that they did some research themselves, and that they were willing to support research operations in their respective departments, because I felt that that was the only way, really, that we could improve the quality of academic life here. In my view, the quality of an educational institution is basically balanced on a knife edge. There is no room in that for maintaining the status quo. You're either getting better or you're getting worse, because other people are passing you by if you're not getting better. And I insisted in all cases where we were recruiting a chairman for a clinical department that that person have academic credentials in research, and that that person was willing and eager, in fact, to support research in their own particular disciplines. That, for me, was the goal.
In terms of the last few years since you've been here, anything you want to give as a postscript on your time at Brown?
No, it was a very important time in my life. I have very good memories, and I have a feeling of real accomplishment. I would say that, and this is not unique to me, that in many cases, nobody understands better than the dean himself what he or she has accomplished. That people really are only only understand their own piece of the world. But somebody has to take the overview of the whole institution, and that person has got to be the dean. And so the dean is the only one really who can understand how the different pieces fit, and whether they fit well, and whether the institution has moved ahead or not on a broad front. And I think the institution moved ahead. And I'm very happy about that. In many areas, it didn't move ahead as fast or as much as I would have liked. But I'm not sure my expectations were always entirely realistic. It's better to push, I think, than just to accept.
Well, that may be a good word on which to end. And I think your legacy is impressive, and it will span into the future.
I hope so.
And I'm glad that that we were able to get at least a portion of it on tape.
I take a particular view of legacies. There are substantive achievements, and people are brought into the institution as a result of the activities of the leader. But in fact, it's a case of the king is dead, long live the king. As soon as the dean steps down, everybody is interested only in talking to the next dean. And that's perfectly realistic. I mean, I did that when I was a department chairman or a faculty member, and I really do understand that. So the most important the most important evaluation, I think, is my own, to me. I'm happy if people are happy with what I did, but I know better what I did and didn't do than anybody else can.
I think that's a great insight, and it's also unique in our interviews.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think that's all. I've enjoyed this very much.
Oh, so have I. Hopefully so have our videographers. So today is October 29th, 2007. We had the pleasure of interviewing former Dean Donald Marsh. We are at 169 Angel in the CIS at Brown University. Thank you.